Quick thing before we begin. We're building something special here, and every subscriber helps. Now, let's get into it. 1,500 miles, that's the distance between the river valleys of Wyoming and the Caprock Canyons of the Texas Panhandle. And the paper trail, the linguistic and historical record, says a single splinter band covered that ground in roughly one human lifetime. Not centuries, one lifetime. At its peak, the nation that band became controlled an estimated 240,000 square miles of territory, larger than the original 13 American colonies combined. Spanish colonial officials feared it. Mexican military commanders paid tribute to avoid it. The United States Army spent the better part of 40 years trying to contain it. And yet almost everything that made this nation feel ancient, feel singular, feel like it had always been there, its name, its dialect, its separate identity as a people, is arguably no older than 300 years. Younger than some of the Spanish missions its warriors burned to the ground. Linguists place the split from the Shoshone at around 1700. Not a millennium ago. Not even close to it. A date you could fit inside 8 or 9 generations. Comfortably within the kind of time frame families track through grandparents and great-grandparents. So here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. If the most feared cavalry force in North American history is, by language and by blood, one of the youngest nations on the entire continent, who, exactly, was underneath the name? To understand how strange that question really is, you have to start with the story historians agree on. The people who eventually became this nation were originally part of the Eastern Shoshone, specifically the Wind River Shoshone, a Numic-speaking people rooted in the Great Basin, a region spanning what's now Nevada, Utah, and western Wyoming. Sometime in the late 17th century, one or more bands broke away. The most likely candidates were the Katsoteca, a name that translates roughly to bison eaters, and by most reconstructions, they were probably the first to go. They didn't leave on horseback. That part matters, because it complicates the mythology that comes later. Initial migration was on foot, pedestrian bison hunters moving southeast through Wyoming and Colorado, following herds onto the open grassland of the southern plains. It was only afterward that horses entered the story, filtering north out of Spanish New Mexico. The 1680 Pueblo Revolt is usually credited as the accelerant. Spanish colonists were driven out, their horse herds scattered and captured. And within a generation, those animals were moving through indigenous trade networks far faster than any Spanish official wanted. By the early to mid-1700s, something new had been built, a fully equestrian, nomadic economy organized around horses and bison, more mobile and more lethal than anything the southern plains had seen before. This was the foundation of what would later be called, without much exaggeration, the Lords of the Southern Plains. Even the name carries history in it. Comanche comes from the Ute word Comanche, roughly enemy or stranger, adopted into Spanish colonial records by 1706 and never changed since. By the mid-1700s, the territory this newly formed nation controlled, Comanchería, stretched across the Texas Panhandle, eastern New Mexico, southwestern Kansas, and western Oklahoma. An empire, in every functional sense, assembled within a single century. And here's the detail most tellings skip past too quickly. Contact with the Wyoming relatives didn't end the moment the split happened. By multiple historical accounts, some connection with Shoshone bands back in Wyoming persisted until the 1830s, over a century after the migration began, before Cheyenne and Arapaho expansion finally cut the line. Two related peoples, staying in some kind of touch for more than 100 years after supposedly becoming two separate nations. 300 years. A dozen generations, maybe a few more. That's not deep time. That's not the kind of separation that turns one people into two who can barely understand each other. And yet the linguistic distance between Comanche and Shoshone, how different they actually sound, how differently they're actually classified, depends entirely on which measurement you trust. Which is where this story stops being tidy. Here is where it gets complicated. There are two different ways to measure how long ago Comanche broke off from Shoshone, and they don't agree with each other. The historical and archaeological consensus, treaties, Spanish records, oral tradition, puts the split around 1700. Call it 300 years, 12 to 15 generations. But there's a second method, glottochronology, a technique that estimates language divergence based on how fast a language replaces its own basic vocabulary over time. Run the Comanche-Shoshone split through that method, and some estimates push the initial divergence back to roughly 1546, not 300 years, closer to 480. A gap of nearly 150 years between two legitimate ways of asking the exact same question. Researchers who work with glottochronology are careful to frame results like this as probability, not certainty. The method has known calibration problems, and it's treated across linguistics as a useful estimate, not a verdict. Not by years, by centuries. That's the size of the disagreement sitting underneath a simple origin story. One anthropologist's account from Cody Newton describes the Comanche language as only moderately differentiated from Eastern, specifically Wind River, Shoshone. Closely related, barely distinct by the normal rules of how languages drift apart over time. Here is where the consensus story from a moment ago needs a correction. Pre-reservation Comanche bands did not operate anything like a closed, exclusive membership system. Historian Thomas W. Cavanaugh, in his 1999 study The Comanches, A History, documents that a substantial number of people identified as Comanche traced their ancestry to Arapaho, Crow, Shoshone, Hopi, and Pueblo peoples, entirely separate nations, folded into Comanche kinship over generations. And that's before accounting for the captives. Spanish, Mexican, Anglo-American, and German Texan children were routinely taken and adopted into Comanche families, a practice documented from the early 1700s onward, not as a marginal footnote, but as a structural feature of how bands grew. Not one bloodline, not one lineage, not one closed gene pool. That's three different ways of saying the same uncomfortable thing. The tidy story, one band splits, one band migrates, one band becomes a nation, describes a political and linguistic lineage. It does not describe a single sealed population in any genetic sense. To understand why that distinction matters, it helps to zoom out to the broader science of indigenous American ancestry. Researchers such as Antonio Tironi established, decades ago, a foundational framework built on mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down only from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged unless a new mutation slips in. Think of it as a surname that only mothers pass on, one that stays identical for thousands of years unless something rare interrupts it. Tironi's work showed that nearly all indigenous American maternal lineages trace back to just a handful of founding haplogroups, A, B, C, D, and X. Building on that, a 2007 study published in PLOS ONE by Erica Tam and colleagues, including Ripon Malhi of the University of Illinois, modeled what's called the Beringian standstill, a long period of genetic isolation before the peopling of the Americas. Their work demonstrated something crucial. Small founding populations amplify genetic drift dramatically. Imagine a photocopy of a photocopy. Each generation, small errors and random shifts get copied forward and exaggerated, until the copy looks less and less like the original. That's the same mechanism that would apply to any small breakaway band splitting off from a larger population, Comanche included. And here's the flag that has to be stated plainly, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. No comprehensive, peer-reviewed genome-wide study of enrolled Comanche Nation citizens' ancestry has been published as of this year. What we know about the genetic composition behind the name is extrapolated from historical adoption records, from regional Native American population genetics, from linguistic dating methods that disagree with each other by a century and a half, not from a direct, dedicated genomic test of the tribe itself. So the founding population was small. It was recent by any historical standard, and by the tribe's own documented practice, it was never closed. Which raises the actual question historians argue about underneath all of this. Was this ever one bloodline in the first place? The first theory says, it doesn't matter, because the time frame is too short for any of this to show up genetically anyway. Call it the splinter and drift model. Given only around 300 years, 12 to 15 generations, mainstream historical linguists and anthropologists, Cavanaugh and Newton among them, treat the Comanche-Shoshone divide as a difference of dialect, not of population. Under this model, if you ran standard autosomal ancestry testing today, you would expect no meaningful genetic distinction between Comanche descendants and Wind River Shoshone populations. The time depth, according to this theory, is simply too short for genetic drift to have done much of anything. There's a number that seems to support this. Contact between the two groups, Comanche bands and their Wyoming relatives, reportedly persisted until the 1830s, over a century of documented interaction after the split. That's consistent with two populations that never drifted very far apart at all, genetically speaking. But here is the limitation this theory can't get around. It assumes a mostly closed founding population, a group that grew over a century and a half, primarily through births within the group. And that assumption runs directly into the wall we just built in the last few minutes. The large-scale, multi-generational, well-documented practice of captive adoption. Look at the population numbers themselves. Jedediah Morse, writing around 1820, estimated the tribe's population at 38 to 41,000 people. Multiple contemporary 19th century observers pushed estimates as high as 30,000 by mid-century. Those are not small numbers, and they are, by most demographic logic, too large to be explained by natural birth rate growth alone. Not from one small Wyoming splinter band, not in only a century and a half. That gap, between what a closed, drifting population could plausibly produce and what actually existed on the ground, is the tell. Something else was adding people to these numbers. Something other than simple descent. But if it wasn't simple growth from a single bloodline, there's a second, far messier explanation for how this identity, and this gene pool, actually took shape. That messier explanation doesn't start on a horse. It starts in captivity. Call it the second theory, the absorption model. Under this reading, the identity and the gene pool weren't primarily built through lineal descent at all. They were built through systematic captive taking and adoption, repeated across generations, until adoption itself became one of the primary engines of population growth. Historian Curtis Merez, in a 2001 study published in American Quarterly, examined how the captivity of Spanish and Mexican individuals functioned as a literal mechanism of becoming Comanche in the borderlands. Not an exception to the culture, but a structural part of how it replenished and expanded itself. The scale of it is what's easy to underestimate. Raids into northern Mexico are documented as capturing captives by the tens of thousands across multiple generations, for labor, for trade, and critically, for adoption directly into kinship bands, not held apart as a separate class, folded in, given names, given families, given a place at the fire. Kavanaugh's claim from the last section deserves a second look here, because it's more damning in context. His estimate, that by the 1930s, fewer than 10% of Comanches alive could accurately be called full blood, has been challenged by the Oklahoma Historical Society, which flags the specific figure as probably an exaggeration. But notice what that pushback actually disputes. Not the direction of the trend, just its precision. Nobody serious is arguing the opposite, that the population stayed genetically closed. The argument is only about how far the door was open, not whether it was open at all. Here's where the picture compounds rather than resolves. Layer a second collapse on top of the adoption pattern. At its mid-19th century peak, population estimates for the tribe run as high as 20 to 30,000 people, sometimes higher. By the time of the 1890 United States Census, that number had cratered to just 1,598, a decline of roughly 90 to 95% in about 40 years, driven by smallpox, by cholera, by sustained warfare, and by the deliberate destruction of the southern bison herds that the entire economy depended on. Sit with that number for a second. 90 to 95% gone, not over centuries, within one long human lifetime. And then the population came back. Today, the Comanche Nation counts somewhere around 17 to 18,000 enrolled citizens. Rebuilt almost entirely in the century and a half since that 1890 low point. A population that falls by over 90% and then reconstitutes itself into the thousands within a few generations is not quietly drifting forward from a single Wyoming ancestor. It is being rebuilt generation after generation out of whoever survived the collapse and whoever married into the survivors afterward. This is the part the records don't fully explain, and it pushes the story somewhere most researchers are visibly uncomfortable following all the way to the end. The third theory, and it's the one most historians are hesitant to say out loud, because it doesn't just complicate the origin story, it potentially erases the premise underneath it. Asks whether there was ever a single bloodline to begin with, even at the very start, before any of the adoption, before any of the collapse. What if the founding splinter itself was never one extended family breaking cleanly away from the Shoshone? What if it was already a coalition, multiple Numic-speaking bands pooling together for the economic advantage of controlling horses and bison on newly opened ground? A political and military alliance dressed up, in hindsight, as a family tree. The oral traditions themselves don't agree on why the split happened in the first place. Some accounts describe a dispute between camps. Others describe something closer to a race for access to Spanish trade goods and horses. Two very different origin stories for the same event, which is exactly the kind of disagreement you'd expect if the event was social and political, not a clean biological branching off a single trunk. Researchers are careful to frame this possibility as speculative, not settled, because it can't currently be tested the way it would need to be. No ancient DNA from 17th or 18th century Proto-Comanche burial contexts has been sequenced and published. Without that, there's no direct way to check whether a genetically coherent founding population ever existed at all, or whether the name itself has always described something looser, a repeatedly reconstituted political identity, laid over a gene pool that was already mixed before the migration even began. Picture a dusk gathering at a band's camp near the Wichita Mountains, sometime in the 1850s. Several extended families pulled in close around cook fires, the kind of evening that repeated itself thousands of times across a century of Comanchería. Hundreds of horses picketed in loose rows nearby. Contemporary Anglo and Spanish observers described herds in the tens of thousands attributed to bands like this one. Animals that represented wealth, mobility, and survival all at once. The air carries the specific, unmistakable smell of tanned bison hide, worked soft over days by hand. Spanish loanwords drift in and out of the conversation around the fire, threaded so naturally into the dialect that nobody pauses to notice they're there. In one corner of that circle, a grandmother, herself taken as a captive decades earlier, adopted fully into the band, married and raising children who were raising children of their own, is teaching her granddaughter to quill a cradleboard, the same patterns passed hand to hand for generations. Around that fire sit 3, maybe 4 distinct ancestries, Comanche and Mexican and Puebloan and more, sharing one household, one language, one identity, without a single person there treating it as remarkable. Because to them, it wasn't. It was simply what a family looked like. Nobody in that circle would have called what ran through their blood a mystery. That word only gets attached later, by outsiders, generations afterward, trying to compress a fluid, absorbing, endlessly rebuilding population down into one tidy word and one clean people. Here is where the deepest layer of this finally comes into focus. Modern population genetics reference panels are built on an assumption that a tribal population is a discrete, stable signal, one clean genetic thread you can trace backward without interference. This population's actual history resists that assumption more forcefully than almost any other case in North America. Stack the layers and look at what you're actually dealing with. First, a Beringian founder effect roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago or more. Genomic research from Eski Willerslev and colleagues, published in Nature in 2018 using the ancient USR1 genome from Alaska, places a single founding population splitting from East Asian ancestors around 36,000 years ago, with genetic exchange continuing until roughly 25,000 years ago. Second, a much smaller and far more recent founder bottleneck at the Shoshone split, roughly 300 years back. Third, a catastrophic demographic collapse in the 1880s and 1890s that took the population down to under 1,600 people. 3 separate compressions. 3 separate points where a population got squeezed down to a fraction of its former size. Erica Tam's 2007 research with Ripan Malhi on serial founder effects showed exactly how each of these bottleneck events amplifies genetic drift and narrows diversity. Like a photograph copied and recopied, each version drifting further from the original. This population went through that mechanism not once, but at least 3 times on radically different timescales, with large-scale absorption of outsiders folded into the gaps between each collapse. Clean. Expected. Neither of those words apply here. So when researchers finally do sit down and test Comanche DNA with the rigor this story deserves, they are not going to find one unbroken ancient bloodline, quietly confirming a single heroic lineage running in a straight line back to Wyoming. What they will find, if the historical pattern holds, is a compressed genetic record of survival. Through repeated near collapse, through repeated absorption of people who were never supposed to belong to the bloodline in the first place, and through a population that kept rebuilding itself out of whoever remained. That is arguably a far more remarkable finding than a pure lineage would have been. It also reframes the very question this story opened with. This nation isn't genetically young because its history is thin. It's young and layered because its history represents one of the most compressed, highest-intensity demographic experiences of any population on this continent. Beringian dispersal, sudden linguistic branching, mass captive absorption, near-total collapse, and full-scale rebuilding, all within a fraction of the time span most nations take to form. Zoom out far enough, and none of this is actually unique. Every human genome alive today is a compressed archive of migration, of bottleneck, of mixture with people who weren't supposed to belong to the family tree. This case is simply unusually visible, well documented, comparatively recent, easy to trace in written records in a way that most population histories never are. The same founder effect mechanics that shape this story reach all the way back to the Beringian ancestors of every indigenous nation on the continent, which leaves the harder questions sitting in the open, unanswered on purpose. What does it mean for a people, a nation, an identity to be defined by blood at all, when even one of history's most cohesive, most feared, most singular-seeming nations turns out to have been built from repeated absorption, not from one sealed bloodline running unbroken through time? Think of it less like a single river flowing in one direction from a known source, and more like a river fed by tributary after tributary, each one carrying its own current in from somewhere else, until it's no longer possible to say which water came from where, only that the river is real and moving, and still carrying all of it forward. Because when scientists finally test Comanche DNA in full, the results won't just rewrite Comanche history. They may rewrite what we think a people ever really was.